To the Gunflint Trail Historical Society's 50th anniversary and birthday, and the Chik-Wauk Museums and Nature Center's, I gotta get this right, 10th.
No.
15th.
15th, I'm sorry. I knew I was gonna mess up. 15th. Actually, yesterday it opened up 15 years ago on July 4th. So we are so excited. I want to first of all see any show of hands for any trustees or people that were involved on day one. I know there's at least a couple in the room. There we go. Yes. Don't be shy. Raise that hand nice and high. Excellent. Thank you for your vision. Okay, another show of hands for anyone that has been a trustee of the Gunflint Trail Historical Society anytime in the past 15, 20 years, yes. Raise your hand nice and high. I want you to look around into the room. Again, their vision, their foresight, their ability to raise a lot of money. I'm putting it bluntly, we do not get government funding to run this. So people had to get out there and work hard, and to see where this has come in really 15 years is remarkable. To have 5 buildings now that you can go into, some of them built completely by volunteers. The watercraft building was built by volunteers. So I'm humbled. I follow in some gigantic footsteps, and so thank you to that. And then I got one more shout out. I think what makes us also unique is our engagement of people. We do a ton of programs, a ton of outreach. Next Thursday we got the YMCA day camp coming up, and that happens as a result of our current staff. So current staff, a lot of them have yellow shirts wandering around. You gotta raise your hand. Hi. Emma and Bonnie, and one tiny bit bigger shout out. Bonnie is also celebrating her 10th year working year round. She is the brains and the operational expertise of this whole organization, so we owe a lot to Bonnie. So thank you. We got a program too, a two-parter. I'm super excited about this. We have Justine Kerfoot is going to lead us off talking about Gunflint Lodge and the start of that, and they're celebrating their 100th anniversary today. And then Bonnie is going to follow up with some history on the start of this and Chik-Wauk. So Sue, we owe a ton to the Kerfoot family for the start of this. There's just no question. Bruce almost single-handedly raised a lot of those initial funds, and Sue has really been involved and is a historian in her own right. So we're excited to hear her presentation. You're up for a month, I think, about?
Yeah, a month.
Yeah, we're glad to have you. So we're going to turn it right over to you. Thank you.
I think calling me a historian is a little over the limit, but I do know stories, and that's it. And I'm going to talk about the beginning of Gunflint Lodge up until the time that Bruce took over from Justine. There's a lot going on, and that's an area that perhaps is the least known. Most of you knew Bruce and I doing it, and for better or worse. And so today we're going to concentrate on some of these other people. And of course, the person we have to start with is Russell Blankenburg. And this is Russell. He worked for his mother in 1924 in a resort she had called Lighthouse Lodge in Wisconsin. In fact, the lighthouse that is on the Sag Channel is something that Russell put up that had to do with that. Anyway, he was checking out some guests in 1924, and it was a fishing camp. That's really what it was. Wisconsin was really just opening up at that time. And they told him what a great time they had, but they weren't going to be back next year because they'd heard of a new area that had opened up, the Gunflint. And so after the resort was closed, Russell came up to see what this Gunflint was all about. And he was looking at Gunflint Lake, which was just about as far as the road went then. And he met a man on the portage, or on the landing, that had a load of lumber being delivered for his new cabin. And for those of you who live on the lake, you know the name Ben Gallagher. And Russell ultimately bought what I think was basically the south shore of the lake, from the public landing to Ear-Shaped Bay. And he also, at the same time, stupid man that he was, took all their money in 1925 and 26 out of the stock market and put it into land on Loon Lake, Seagull, Saginaw Lake. So, and then he sold it over the years. He never sold a lot of it. And Nancy, where's Nancy? Her mother knows that when you went to Russell, well, he just had 1 or 2 lots available, but maybe he would like one of them. That's what he was. Anyway, Russell talked his mother into starting a resort up here. They figured it would complement the fishing in that the Lighthouse Lodge would be in the spring and fall, and up here would be in the main of the summer, which was still spring and fall here. And he started building in 1925, and he told his mother that he would help her take and build the place. And let's go on one step. All right, this is Dora Blankenburg. I always thought her name was Doris, but it's not. Her birth name was Medora, M-A-D-O-R-A. And she was up here. I don't really know how much she did with that axe, but and they built a small resort, and then she quickly decided that it was too much work. It was a long drive up. She didn't want to have that much work, and so she talked with her lawyer, a man named George Spunner. And George Spunner was Justine's father. And let's go on again. Okay, here's Russell again. This is the lodge they built. And this is it again, showing, it's basically the same location as the current lodge is. So, and this is George Spunner. George Spunner was a relatively wealthy lawyer, lived in the suburb of Chicago called Barrington. And he had stock in a bank, and he was a lawyer, and he taught Sunday school, and he gave an organ to the church, and he took long trips. He and his wife and his daughter would go on 4,000 or 5,000 mile trips, once out to New York, down to Mexico. They went to, of course, they didn't drive all the way to Cuba. And then one more. This is May Spunner, Justine's mother, a beautiful woman, very accomplished. She, which was unusual for women in her age, went to Northwestern University and graduated. She taught school for a while, and while she was in Barrington, she was basically a busy socialite. She started the library, she started the women's club, she was involved with the Girl Scouts, she was involved in Red Cross during World War I. And one more. Here she is again. She gave talks. And I've often wondered, she gave talks in the suburbs around Barrington. The places that I've read that she talked on, and it was Native Americans and seashells of all things. The places she gave talks on were within easy driving distance now, but I'm sure it wasn't then. And I don't think she drove a car. I'm guessing she had a chauffeur take her from A to B. So, okay, let's go. And this is her with her daughter. She had 3 children. One daughter died in infancy. She had a son who died at age 14, and this is Justine. And it's very interesting. And then let's go on to the next one. Here's Justine. Mother raised mice and rabbits for medical experiments. And Justine was in charge of cleaning the pens. But Justine grew up into one person we would never recognize. Let's look at her. This is Justine high school graduation. And the only reason I know it's high school is because when she got to college, she cut her hair. So there was nothing really interesting in that. But and on the back of this photograph, in Grandma Spunner's handwriting, she wrote beautiful. She had a very florid handwriting, and so I can always recognize her handwriting. At any rate, they took, and let's look at the next. Here's Justine, probably on her first trip up to Gunflint. They came up when May learned, probably from her husband, that Gunflint Lodge was for sale. And the idea was that May, I think, today we would call what she was going through empty nest, because 2 of her children had died. The 3rd one was in college. She had been busy for years and years and years. She taught elocution, she gave plays, she did everything. And it might have been getting just a little tiring, the same old again and again. And so when she heard that Gunflint Lodge was for sale, she came up and went to look the place over. And Justine and a friend of hers from college, Mary Cunningham, were sent on a canoe trip with Art Smith. And the 2 women, Mrs. Blankenburg and Mrs. Spunner, negotiated the sale of the resort. And May Spunner bought it in her own name. It cost $12,000. And I don't know exactly how much land that they bought, but they had a fair amount of land. I think I know of one addition, what is now Gunflint Pines, Bruce added on, but the rest of it, I'm not sure exactly what the size of the land was. Okay, let's go to the next one. So what did they buy? They bought a lodge. This is Russell's Lodge. You can kind of see right here, that's where it was. And she had C.O. Backlund, which was a firm that was still in existence in this area when I came here, go and build some cabins and a boathouse and additions on each end of the lodge. Let's take and go one more. This is another picture, a little bit after it was built. Next picture. This is the dining lounge area. That was next to the lake. And then the next picture, this was the dining room. Look at those chairs. Those are the ones that Justine copied when she had to rebuild them. And then disaster struck. They bought in August of 1929. And by October, the Depression was there. And like many people, they thought, I'm sure, that the Depression was going to be over, you know, maybe a month, maybe a year, but it'd be all right. Well, of course, it didn't work that way. And while this was going on, May and Justine were up running a resort, learning to run a resort. And they divided it up. May was the hostess. She answered the mail, planned the meals, and supervised the staff. And Justine did the ordering, paying the bills, and the maintenance. And the maintenance was probably the worst because she had no one to teach her. And somebody asked her once how she learned to repair motors, and she said, I took them apart to find out how they functioned and to discover what part wasn't working. And the only thing I can say is it sounds easier than it probably was. So, all right, and one of the things that Gunflint Lake was blessed with was a very wonderful population of Native Americans. Oh, this is one of the cabins that they bought. Really basic. This is Natalin's plumber. She is the matriarch of the plumber family. And Mom said that when they came to put up ice, she and Mrs. Cook and the whole family would snowshoe over to help put up ice. Okay, next one. This is Walter Plummer. right here, and it's on the speeder car that they used to use on the railroad on the north side of the lake. And May is standing with the sunglasses in the top. And Justine wrote that this is perhaps the only time her mother ever was on the speeder car. So, but they take guests for a ride along. Okay, next. This is George Plummer. You know, he was around for a long time as a guy, but here he is as a young man. Next one. This is Lillian Plummer. Her Indian name was Abuch, and Bruce couldn't quite get the Abuch out when he was a child, so they called her Butchie. And she would be working at the lodge for a long, long time in various capacities. Next one. This is Mrs. Tamarack and Mrs. Spruce. And they are two Native American women who lived across the lake in the compound where Plumbers were now. And they would come over, next picture. They would build a teepee at Gunflint Lodge during the summer, and that's what they lived in. And this was the beginning of the teepee, and then we'll go to the next one. And this was the completed teepee, and Mrs. Spunner would explain to the guests what was going on and how it was built and everything else. Okay, and this is Abby and Charlie Cook. They were the other family on the north shore of the lake. Charlie's cabin was in the back of the bay, just to the right of, or to the east of the Narrows. And Charlie, for years and years and years, guided. Mother had a unique experience with Abby. Charlie married, his wife didn't like it, the marriage lasted a week. Abby married Bessie Blackjack. That was another Native American family, and they had a child, and there was no one to deliver the baby, and Justine was called in to deliver the baby, and which luckily apparently was a very normal, uneventful delivery. But at the end of the delivery, of course the bedding was bloody, and Mother told Abby that he should wash the bedding in cold water. And she saw him later. He had tied him up and he was dragging him behind a boat in the lake. And then there was I had a picture, but couldn't find it. A man named Billy Connors, who was a Native American, and he would come over in the evening and play his tom-tom and dance. So there were some really wonderful people who taught Justine to snowshoe, to paddle a canoe. You know, we can't think of her not being able to paddle a canoe. She must have known it from birth. But she didn't. She learned it from the Indians. And she told me herself that when she learned how to do it, she would paddle back and forth in front of the lodge until she figured out how to do it. So it was very interesting and learning experience. She also learned to run a dog team with them. Now, they weren't the big teams that we see for the Iditarod or around here. I think she had 3 dogs or 4 dogs. But she said, snowmobiles took over from the dog team, but you never walked home when you had a dog team, and you would with a snowmobile sometimes. So that was interesting. But the Native Americans accepted her and always did. In fact, I can remember when I first came up here, one day I stood with Butchie on the shore and she said, this is a white pine, this is a red pine, this is a balsam, this is a birch. Of course, I didn't remember them all at once, but I'm sure she did the same thing with Justine. And the Indians taught Bruce how to fish, how to be a woodsman, how to take and butcher a moose with only a knife, no axe, no nothing. And he learned to guide, as he started guiding when he was 12 years old. And he would be the 5th guide in a big party. And then when he would go out on his own, Charlie would be there and they'd be discussing where they're going. And Bruce would say, well, I'm going to go up to North Lake. And Charlie would say, I'll go there too. And then Charlie never left the lake until Bruce left. He was always watching over him to make sure that he didn't have any real problem. And 1930 was not a good year. Business was terrible. There were all these unpaid bills for the new cabins and the new construction at the lodge. And it really looked like Gunflint Lodge was going to fail, just as many other businesses did. But Justine went around to all of their creditors and she said, I will pay you a little bit every week until the bills are paid. And the president of the bank, A.M. Anderson in town, also spoke with the creditors and said, give her a chance, give her a chance. And Mrs. Blankenburg said, just pay me interest. That's all you have to do. And slowly, the two women worked their way out of debt. But it was all her life, Mother never wanted to borrow money again because it was such a project. So, and they tried several ways to increase the business of the lodge. One of them was that they bought an island, of course on credit, on Sag, and they had Saginaw Lodge. And they tried to, people would go up there and fish down the Granite River, and then they'd spend a couple days fishing on Sag, and then they'd come back. And Saginaw Lodge was run by a woman named Jane Vale, who was from Grand Marais, and another woman named Val McElhaney. I'm going to say it wrong. McElhaney, a college classmate from Northwestern University. And Val ultimately would marry Benny Ambrose. So, and another thing that they did, let's go to the next picture, I think, yes. They leased the North Lake Forest Service cabin. And guests would go up to North Lake and they would be able to fish there for several days. And I don't really know the terms of it, nor do I know why it was the Minnesota Forest Service camp. And I don't know why they stopped leasing it, but I know there was a period of time when they did it. The place on Sag, they had to ultimately give up. They couldn't afford payments on both Gunflint Lodge and the Sag place, so they didn't. And by 1930, 31, George Spunner was ruined. He had been a stockholder in a major, not a major bank, a bank in Barrington, Illinois. And those of you who are, like me, crazy in history, heard of double indemnity, and it meant the stockholders were responsible to their depositors for double the amount of money they had. And it literally ruined George. They lost everything. And Gunflint Lodge was the only thing they kept because it was owned by his wife. She had sold a farm that she owned for the down payment, and everything was in his wife's name. So they moved out of this area, or out of Illinois, to come up here. And it was an unbelievable change in lifestyle. You know, we showed that picture of Justine. Well, in those days, the newspaper would write, and I've seen the local paper and seen several things about the dinner dances that Justine hosted with a live orchestra. And New Year's Eve, she had 30 people over for a dinner dance and an orchestra and games. They played bridge or whatever. And it's hard for us to see her doing that. But at any rate, that's what happened. Okay. So in the fall, they moved up to Gunflint. And Mr. Spunner, Grandpa Spunner, was ruined, not only financially, but mentally. He wanted nothing to do with the business. The two things that he did the most were he guided fishing parties and he had a garden, a big, huge garden, right where the Outfitters is located today. And he grew strawberries and potatoes. Those were his best crops. I don't know what all else, but those things they got a lot of. And here they are. It's in the winter. May and George are on the right. They're talking with guests who are leaving. I know they're leaving because it says that on the top. Okay, let's look at the next one. Here's George guiding. And this is the photograph, actually, that is part of the logo of Gunflint Lodge right now. So, and I think the one guy is a man named Davis who used to be And look at the size of that motor. We have some of those over in the web building. Okay, next. All right. By 1931, 32, everybody is established. They know their roles. The business is moving. I don't know how much money they're making, but they are paying off debts. And a man named Bill Kerfoot came to camp on the west end of Gunflint Lake. And Bill had dreamed of going into the Foreign Service. But, of course, the Depression came, and that was the end of that. His father was the president of Hamlin University. He was kind of a pain in the neck, I'm sure, to his father. He graduated from Hamlin by special vote of the Board of Trustees. But Bill was an addition, and he was willing to work for room and board, and of course they had no money. That was it. And he could talk with people. He was much more outgoing than Justine was. He could guide people. He was a little bit of a carpenter, and Justine got that little twinkle in her eye. And in typical fashion for the two of them, they decided one day in September of 1934 to get married. And so they drove to town and got married that day. And that was it. Later on, May sent out announcements of the marriage. And of course, George Spunner wasn't really capable of doing what he did before. He wasn't a lawyer anymore. He wasn't anything except a guide and a gardener. And May had an interesting change in her life, because when she was in Barrington, she was with these women's groups, the library, the women's club, the Sunday school. And all of a sudden she comes up here, and I've read her diary of that first year. And it's all men, except for a couple Indian women. That was about it. And so that was a big thing, but she had a business to run, and I believe that May Spunner is the one who got the family through the Depression. George was no good. Justine was 22. You know, she wasn't capable of doing it, but May had run her, whether it was mice or rabbits or whatever, run little businesses, organized different committees, and I think she's the one who got them through the whole mess. And one of the other things that really was a big deal was getting to town. It's almost impossible to realize what it was. I read May recounting in her diary one day she and George were going to town, and the car broke down before they got to Rockwood. So George walked off to get help, and he couldn't get help and get back there until 5 hours had passed. And then in another diary, May talks about a trip Justine made to town, and she made it to town all right. This was in the winter. And in the winter time, you know, nobody wanted to go to town. The road was only plowed at Christmas and at Easter. And if you went to town or had to go to town, you hoped somebody had to go before you, because they could shovel, hand shovel, all the uphills going in, and then whoever came back could hand shovel the uphills coming home. So May got to town, and that was, or Justine got to town, and that was fine, and she was able to let them know, and don't ask me how, that she was there, and she was coming back the next day. She was going to spend the night. Well, there had been a fire that went through the Gunflint Trail between Hedstrom's Mill and the Pines, and that was open land. In other words, subject to the wind, like very few places are around here. And Justine spent 5 hours shoveling to get through that area. That was all there was to it. I mean, you can't imagine what it took. Okay, so there they are. Let's look at the next picture. Okay, so here's Justine, Bill, May, and George. And some guests. This is at the old lodge. And by now, Justine's gotten rid of her long hair. And basically is wearing men's clothing. Okay, next picture. One of the big problems was getting supplies up. And a man named Don Brazell joined his father at Brazell Motor Freight. And he would run up the Gunflint Trail. He'd offer freight service once a week, starting in 1931. He'd bring the mail up. He would do whatever was necessary to get it up. There was some telephone communication because the Forest Service had a line, and then the Gunflint Trail residents maintained it on their own. So if you went past and the line was down, you were expected to stop and climb the tree and fix it. Because there were no poles, it was just going from tree to tree. And this is Don Brazell. This is Russell Blankenburg. And this is Eve Blankenburg. And the building behind them is what used to be, when I first came up here, the girls' dorm. And it is located right where the two-story building is now. And staff. But it was quite an event when that came. And Don stopped in 1931, once gas rationing ended, and he would take and no longer haul passengers because you could go back and forth yourself. But he continued to carry the mail. And he was a guy who kept track of everything, I suppose, a little diary. And he discovered, and it's basically almost always true, that in the spring when the ice goes out, the small lakes and the pond on the Tuscarora Road go out, and 2 weeks later Gunflint Lake goes out. And that's just observation that he's seen all these times. There was another woman named Agnes Jackson, Aggie Jackson, who was a cook. And her father had run road crews and logging camps, and Aggie learned to cook there. And she came and cooked for Justine for years and years and years, and was a wonderful cook. The only thing I ever ate of hers that I didn't like was when she made spaghetti sauce, she put so much whole rosemary in, we called it pine needle spaghetti. But the other thing was she was really versatile. She'd talk with the guests. She could split kitchen wood, change diapers. She started out changing diapers on Bruce, and she finished changing diapers on his children. But a good-hearted person, worked to beat the band. Just unbelievable. She served 3 meals a day. And in later years, when Bruce and I were married, you know, you get a cook and they don't always stay for the whole season. And so Aggie would come for a month or before or after and cook. And Butchie would come over, and the two of them would work together in the kitchen. And Aggie taught me the most important lesson on serving good food. She said, everybody will tell you the food is wonderful, but the real test is go to the dish pit and see if the plates are clean when they come out back or half eaten. And that was something that I learned. Okay, so let's go to the next one. This is Janet Hansen, who came up in 1946. She was from Duluth. She came up in the early 30s before Justine was married on canoe trips. She was in the Red Cross in Europe during the war, drove ambulance. She had been teaching at Columbia, and she came back and was just restless. Didn't know what she wanted to do, so she called Justine to see if she could come up. Well, Justine hesitated, they weren't really open, blah, blah, blah. And finally, Janet said, well, I'll help with chores. And so they let her come up. And let's go to the next picture. She joined a family, a single woman joining this family, and that's Bill and Justine. Sharon is in Justine's lap. There's Bruce, and there's Pat next to Bruce. And after she'd been there a week, Justine got word from Florida that her mother had a stroke and she was going to have to go to Florida to see her mother. And Janet said, well, she'd help with chores and keep the house going. And so off Justine went, and 2 days later or something, Bill said, well, we got 14 hunters coming for dinner. We got to feed them and take care of them. And Janet had virtually no experience. They were going to have chicken, and they had to butcher and pluck the chickens. And Janet said, I don't know how to do this. And Bill said, I don't know either. Can't be that hard. And she finally managed to get on the table. She said that Bruce was the biggest help because he knew where everything was in the kitchen. The two girls were too little, but she got through it. And then she stayed on, let's go to the next, and ran the outfitters. That was the beginning of the partnership between Justine and Bill. And this building, for those of you who've been in a long time, we had some buildings, the dry storage and some others behind the lodge. That's these buildings here. This, when I first came up here, was a workshop. It had so much crap in it, you couldn't do any work, but it's a workshop. And it was behind the lodge. And so it was a very interesting deal. And Janet stayed as Justine's partner until either 69 or 70. And then she moved up here and started Janet's Seagull Outfitters, right on the old road to the public landing on Seagull. Okay. So, in the post-war years, there was a great demand for all the amenities. And so you either adapted and somehow fit them in, or you got left by the wayside. Let's go to the next picture. There's Justine and Janet. Okay, next picture, that's enough. Oh yeah, this time, this building is the new outfitting building, which was a garage converted to outfitting, converted to the girls' dorm when I worked here in 1964, and is now where it was behind the Brazil truck. Okay, next picture. Let's see what we got here. Oh, kids are growing up. There's Justine with 3 kids, and next picture. Let's see, that's May and George Funner. May and George eventually spent more time down in Florida as they got older. And I often wonder how they did it financially. I mean, they had no money. And I think the thing that enabled them to go to Florida, and this is just a supposition on my part, was Social Security. That they collected some, maybe small, but something for Social Security. Okay, so there's May and George. This is Justine with Mama Bun from Swanson's Lodge. And this is when the Northwestern Bell took over the telephone lines. So, but there were still a lot of other things. REA was a big deal. And there were certain businesses that said you gotta have it and others that said you don't have to have it. But Justine believed that it was important, that people would demand it. And so she was on the REA board to bring it in. This would be in the early 50s. And it was the routing of it was a big, big decision. And they generally tried to route it along roads so that it would be easily available for when the power went down or whatever the heck it was. And they made an exception when they came to Loon Lake. Russell Blankenburg was also on the road. Russell Blankenburg believed electricity was important. And so he convinced them to go up and over the hill from Loon Lake on the east side of it to Gunflint. And in fact, the road there is an old portage trail that goes up to the north shore of Loon Lake. And then the line would go directly down the south shore of Gunflint Lake, the main line. And therefore, Russell only needed a spur to get electricity to all his little lots along there. There was another spur that went to Loon Lake Lodge and another spur that went to Heston's. And that was turned out to be a major decision when you think about when the south shore of Loon Lake got electricity, which was in the 1980s. You know, it was really a big deal. And another thing was indoor plumbing. And at that time, Montgomery Ward's had a program to help with plumbing being put into an existing building. And so Justine drew a plan of the whole resort with measurements and that, and she went down to Ward's and showed him her plan. And yeah, they could supply everything, and they would supply everything you needed in the quantities you needed to put plumbing in according to your plan. And then they asked one question: who's going to install it? And Justine said, my brother. One big lie. Bill was a carpenter. He literally cut holes for doors in the sides of cabins, and he would attach a three-sided structure to the cabin. That was going to be the bathroom. He put it on posts. I suppose some of them were just cement blocks, maybe even trees for all I know. And there was a little problem with it in the spring because the cabins would heave and you'd have a gap in the floor between the bathroom and the cabin. But you just waited because pretty soon it'd heave again and go back together. Another problem was during, and Justine did the installation, was during this installation, for a smart woman, when she got on her back installing the faucets for the sinks, she got confused. And oftentimes the hot water was on the right and the cold water was on the left. And so guests would come in, check in, get down to their cabin, and 10 minutes later they're back, we don't have any hot water. Try the right-hand faucet. And we lived with that for more years than I can believe. And then there's one other little problem, and that was the water. And at that time there was an artesian well right across from the lodge where that big balsam tree was that you had to take. Okay. The water was good, it tested pure, but it had iron in, not suspension, which you can filter out, but in solution, which you cannot filter it. But it's connected, the molecules are connected. And as a result, a small film of iron was left on everything. I don't care if it's laundry, toilets, everything that, dishes, the whole thing. And the only way to clean it off was a product called Vanisol, which was basically acid. It would eat your hands and your clothes. And as a result, for many years, Gunflint Lodge had gold-colored glasses and gold-colored towels or brown towels. And if you didn't clean it off, it became a burnt orange color, very deep. And there was one other little problem with the water, and from the guest standpoint, this was perhaps the worst. So the guests check in, they get some ice, they're going back to their cabin, they're going to have a drink before dinner because we serve alcohol at that time. Fine, no problem, until they mixed whiskey with water and it turned black. Didn't change the taste, just a glass of black water, but psychologically it was pretty bad. So, anyway. Okay, so we get up to 1952, we've traveled a long time. And one of the new summer staff members was Eleanor Matsis, known as Matt for many, many years here. And Matt was brilliant, Mensa brilliant. She had her bachelor's degree from Smith College, she had her master's degree from Iowa State. She was hired for a dishwasher. And this is an early picture of her. Naturally, she did much more beyond the dishwashing. And she stayed for a long time. She taught in Grand Marais. There was a period of time when she was driving back and forth between Gunflint every day for school, which in those days was a bigger pain than it is today. But she was on. In June of '52, disaster struck. There were some canoeists who came in, and they wanted to buy some beer, and Bill wouldn't sell it to them because they were underage. And so that night, they broke into the lodge, sold some beer, and were sitting in some overstuffed chairs smoking, and fell asleep. And of course, the cigarettes smoldered, they were killed, but the fire just took the whole lodge out. Nothing was saved. And it was a real, real downfall. But Justine was never a person to say, woe is me. And so there was a road crew out working on the hill just before Gunflint Lodge, from the overlook down. That was one of the first upper places paved because it was such a terrible hill with the dirt road. And she got them in on the weekend to clean the mess up. She talked with Charlie Boostrom, who was retired, and got him to agree to build the new building. And she and Bill sat down with a piece of butcher paper, brown butcher paper, and they designed a lodge. And you've got that hanging in there, and that's the original. I discovered it who knows when. Anyway, they started building. Now all the reservations were destroyed in the fire. So when new people came, they were usually a surprise. And more likely than not, your host or hostess had a hammer in their hand and they were working on the new building. But they worked to beat the band. They were able by August to open the lodge. The only thing that was finished was the kitchen. And there was plywood on the floors. There were no tables that were worth anything. It was a real hodgepodge. But they had never missed one single meal during all that time. They had transformed, literally overnight, Justine's home into a dining room and a kitchen. And they always worked. They had, it was quite a deal. And of course, they used plywood sawhorses for tables. I think they probably scavenged every chair they could find out of a cabin. You probably sat on the floor in the cabins, who knows. But they made it. And they had breakfast ready by 7 a.m. the morning after the fire. Wow. So, yes. It was a project though, and everybody worked hard. The mother told me that the financial stress was the worst. The insurance covered the lumber bill, and that was it. And that winter, they took and yeah, there's Mother. You can do it better than I can. She's making the chairs for the dining room. At that time, they rented a house on Maple Hill so the kids could go to school rather than having to board out. She said it was a choice of whether you wanted to raise your kids or you wanted somebody else to. And Bruce would gather the red birch, which is what the backs were made of, and Mother would do the rest. And let's one more. This is Eleanor Matzes working on it. And eventually, of course, they came through it, but it must have been just a real shock to the system after going through all the financial turmoil of the Depression. And about this time, Bill Kerfoot was establishing a life in Duluth. He was always active in Republican politics, and when Eisenhower was elected, he was appointed district director of customs in Duluth. And he could only come on weekends. The couple really grew apart, and they were divorced in the 50s. And Justine was left to run the operation. Matt helped at the lodge. Janet Hansen was at the outfitters. Bruce was in high school, but he became her right-hand man, and she told me that when he went to college, for the first time in her life, she sat and cried because it was just a thing. And after school, 4 years of school, 2 years in the Army, Bruce came back with his family. The lodge was old and tired. It grossed $40,000 a year. And it's another story. So that's it. Oh. Anybody have any questions that I can't answer?
What year was the fire?
52.
And they were in business in 52.
Yeah. They never stopped.
Never stopped in business.
Yeah. But they had to feed the guests because all the cabins were American plan and they didn't have any kitchens in them. Yeah. Oh, it's
When did it burn down?
52.
What was the month?
June.
And then back up in August?
Yes. Now, not finished by any stretch of the imagination. And they had to cut corners. For example, when they went to shingle the roof, they couldn't afford tar paper. It was a way that they cut corners. And they didn't get the fireplaces in until the next summer when Charlie Boostrom put them in. But you do what you have to do. You know, I remember Bruce saying that the whole family, that would be the girls and Bruce and Eleanor Matsis and Justine, shingled the roof before they moved down to Maple Hill for the winter. And Bruce's sister Sharon was a misplaced person. She never belonged in the woods. And she moaned and groaned the whole time she had to help shingle. Anybody else have anything? Okay.
Well, other questions? Seems true, moving around to next.